The Western leaders rushing to pledge military aid for Ukraine in its fight against the Russian invasion essentially see the conflict as this: a conventional territorial dispute like those that have been redefining the internal borders of Europe for centuries. What they neglect to also see it as is a fight over these. These are parts of the 40,000 kilometre network of pipelines that were built, some of them as far back as the 1970s, to pump Russian gas through Ukraine to European buyers on the other side. These photos were taken before the war broke out, but by all accounts the pipeline has, unlike residential areas of Ukraine, remained relatively unscathed by the conflict. They're also still operating, because if Russia and Ukraine don't agree on anything else, they at least agree that they both need the gas to keep flowing. Even as the war rages, Ukraine receives about $100 million a month from nations to its west for ensuring the gas makes it through the war zones to their terminals in Poland, Hungary, Austria and Romania, among other places. Russia receives even more for the gas itself. Its total gas sales to Europe are around $900 million a day. They are in dispute over the network, but only over who should operate it. One of the first things Russia did when it invaded Ukraine was to seize control of the two main compression centres in Ukraine's east, through which about a third of the Russian gas flows. It's one of the few things the Russian invaders have done successfully in this otherwise bungled invasion, which is a sign of how important the pipelines are. This infuriated the Ukrainians, who called it a gross interference that would lead to significant risks to the integrity of the Ukrainian gas transmission system. But again, neither side has sabotaged the parts of the network supplying Europe, which should have informed Western leaders that there are other ways to respond to this conflict than to send guns and bombs to the battlefield. Russia and Ukraine have been in a dysfunctional partnership over these pipelines ever since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. When Ukraine took control of the network, Russia immediately started accusing it of not paying its bills and skimming off some of the gas for its own domestic use, which has mostly set the tone for the relationship ever since. So recently, Russia started to look for alternative routes. In 2011, it opened Nord Stream 1, which goes around northern Europe, and in 2019 completed the Turk Stream pipeline, going under the Black Sea to the south of Ukraine and coming ashore in Turkey. Last October, it opened a new branch of Turk Stream heading north through Bulgaria and Serbia to its customers in southeastern Europe, such as Hungary, Austria and Italy, the traditional clients of the Ukrainian network. The response from Ukraine was yet another indication of how central this industry is to politics in the region. Foreign Ministry spokesman Oleg Nikolenko said the new branch of Turk Stream undermines Ukraine's national security and Europe's energy security, and that Ukraine would take decisive measures to protect its national interests. You heard that correctly. 6 months ago, Ukraine complained about losing part of a business partnership it had with a country that has since invaded it. The war is, as they say, a continuation of diplomacy by other means. Now, sure, initially the invasion was reported as being about Ukraine wanting to be in NATO, or as Russian President Vladimir Putin says it, NATO wanting to be in Ukraine. But it's now clear that the cause and the solution to this conflict is also intricately entwined with resources. Western leaders could have seen this coming years ago and started building infrastructure to wean Europe off Russian oil and gas. But instead, their response has been of surprise, moral indignation, and in the case of US Vice President Kamala Harris, comical naivety.
Break it down in layman's terms for people who don't understand what's going on and how can this directly affect the people of the United States.
So Ukraine is a country in Europe. It exists next to another country called Russia. Russia is a bigger country. Russia is a powerful country. Russia decided to invade a smaller country called Ukraine. So basically that's wrong.
None of this diminishes the barbarity of the Russian invasion, but it does shed new light on the West's response. Why are we sending military equipment when we could have been undercutting Russian resource markets instead? Well, we might have done that if we weren't fighting a war of our own at home, that is, against environmentalists and the overwhelming groundswell of people in liberal democracies who oppose virtually any extraction or exporting of gas, oil or coal. For as long as Russia and Ukraine have been engaged in a dysfunctional partnership to distribute gas to Europe, various Australian governments, courts and activists have been obstructing companies that would, if they could, sell more gas to Russia's increasingly desperate European clients. But until recently, it was illegal to even look for onshore gas in the state of Victoria, let alone extract it. Australian company Santos has spent most of the past 11 years seeking approval to extract the estimated 1.8 trillion cubic feet of gas, which is about a quarter of all Russia's annual exports to Europe, from Narrabri in New South Wales. The Australian federal government in December kiboshed exploration for an estimated 5 trillion cubic feet of gas off the New South Wales coast because Prime Minister Scott Morrison said it was not the right project for the area's pristine beaches. 3 months later, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the Australian Parliament seeking help in the war against Russia, which he duly received partly in the form of military equipment. Morrison also pledged in a statement to impose maximum costs against Russia for its unprovoked invasion. A better way to impose maximum costs against Russia would be to lift the ban on gas exploration off New South Wales and allow the gas company to sell whatever gas lies under the ocean there to Russia's clients in Europe. To be fair to Morrison, his government has been trying to accelerate progress at Beetaloo in the Northern Territory, where some people estimate there is an extraordinary 500 trillion cubic feet of gas. Resource companies have been jumping through environmental and regulatory hoops at Beetaloo for 10 years, including the 3 years it took for the Northern Territory's Pepper inquiry to hand down the 135 conditions on which the Beetaloo project could proceed. Drilling finally started last year, but every new group of wells requires new permits, which the Northern Territory's ideological bureaucrats are in no hurry to process. This lack of cooperation from authorities is causing resource companies significant angst, which deters investors. Santos CEO Kevin Gallagher told the Financial Review last year his company had spent more than $1 billion exploring and appraising the fields at Narrabri, and yet investors had no assurance until recently that regulators would ever allow the investment to make a return. That's a high-risk environment for any investor, he said. That is definitely true for local companies, but not for their Russian competitors, who benefit enormously every time a bunch of greenies block a new project in the West, which is why, in a cunning and clandestine move, Russians got involved in the anti-fracking protest movement at least 8 years ago. In 2014, NATO Secretary-General Anders Fogh Rasmussen told a think tank in London, "I have met allies who can report that Russia, as part of their sophisticated disinformation operations, engaged with so-called non-government organisations to maintain European dependence on imported Russian gas." And in 2016, Hillary Clinton, who is hardly an enemy of the environmental movement, complained that phony environmental groups funded by Russia were pushing the anti-fracking agenda in the US. Europe is now waking up, finally, to the dilemma of being overly reliant on Russia for its gas and oil. Germany is now reviving 3 of its low-priority LNG terminals as a substitute for the new Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia, which it closed down as a protest against the war in Ukraine. But the terminals won't be operating for at least another year. Portugal is planning to double the capacity of its biggest gas terminal in the next 2 years, and construction of a gas pipeline from Denmark to Poland has been expedited for reasons that hopefully reflect a wider shift in attitudes. Agence France Presse reported this month that the project had been stalled for 9 months while scientists investigated its impact on local populations of, wait for it, mice and bats. The war made it a more pressing issue, a spokesman told AFP. Well, you don't say. It should be a more pressing issue in Australia too. If we really wanted to help Ukraine and hurt Russia, we would do all we could to relieve Europe of its reliance on Russian fuel. If Australia had moved more assertively to develop its gas resources 5 years ago, we would now be in a position to help Ukraine and our European allies in their hour of need, and certainly have a more dramatic positive impact on the most horrific war in Europe for decades. But ironically, the same people who cheer our military aid are usually the same people who think that fossil fuels are destroying the planet and should be left in the ground. Until that changes, it will be increasingly difficult to stop Russia committing atrocities in Europe.